It's Thursday. Go find yourself episode 76.
You beat me to it. I was looking down.
This time.
Is this
the
76
first time
today?
I get to introduce us. So I'm Kiara, and this is my great friend / co-host. Oh, that's why you always do it the wrong way. JD.
So you pointed at me.
It's almost Freaky Friday, but
almost Freaky Friday, almost FU Friday. Lots of stuff going on, lots of news, some crazy conspiracy theories, and some real theories. And what else are we talking about? We got talking about the UAE.
Yeah, well, we got to talk about Winklevoss and how Winklevoss, Gemini is also moving into, is it the UAE? And Coinbase got somewhere.
Is multiple Winklevoss Winklevi?
Winklevoss?
That's what I call them, the Winklevi. But anyways, they probably don't love that. But
we're going to talk about a lot of different things today. So mostly it's some conspiracy. Some people are getting sued. Some people are disappearing. And then we're talking a little bit about crypto arms race expansion, how people in different countries are dealing with the recent anti-money laundering requirements for the FATF and that sort of thing. I think we're going to see that in the news a lot. I don't know if we should just do like a weekly roundup of whoever has decided to deal with anti-money laundering, because it seems like we talk about it every day right now. But that's it. That's what we're talking about.
Sweet. Let's do it. All right, welcome back. I forgot to do the merch shout out before we went live on Twitter Spaces, but just repping Tatum today. Nice. Really funny story. I was talking to a VC partner and friend and kind of an advisor, but I hadn't seen him for a really long time. We got on the call and we're both wearing Tatum shirts. What are the chances of that? Anyways, it was really cool. We had a good laugh about it. It was fun. All right, so we got lots of stuff to cover today.
And only a half hour, already less.
And only a half hour, but let's try to action pack it. Where do you want to start?
We're going to start with multi-chain. So what I woke up to in my wild Twitter and LinkedIn feed, even LinkedIn is up in arms about this. The CEO of multi-chain has disappeared, which, like, I don't know, if I was the CEO of a company, that's definitely what I would do. I would just go away on vacation without notice.
And not tell anybody.
There's a lot of conspiracies about this, which I think is interesting. But before we get into the conspiracies, here is what is actually happening. The multi-chain team cannot find the CEO in good old-fashioned startup status. Not that they are still a startup, but in that good old-fashioned way, the CEO is kind of their primary controller. So they've actually lost access to a number of their servers and accounts and security protocols and all kinds of stuff. So the team is still trying to serve you, and the team has not given up. They haven't just abandoned their posts, which, like, actually good on them. But they have suspended services for over 10 chains. So Keck Chain, Public Mint, Dino Chain, Red Light Chain, Dexit, Ecta, HPB, Onus, Omax, Fendora, and Plank. It's a lot of chains to stop serving all at once. But the intention is that they will start serving you again. So don't get too up in arms about it. And then I hope that this works. If you're watching us, this is the actual tweet that they've put out. So they have a PR specialist. In the past 2 days, the multi-chain protocol has experienced multiple issues due to unforeseeable circumstances, because whoever thinks that your CEO is going to just disappear. So they had some issues scanning Node Network Router 5, which affected their normal cross-chain service. Basically, they don't have the permission to fix it. They're not abandoning you, though, so try to not abandon them.
Yeah.
What do you think?
I think that's cool that we've figured out how to get that shit on the screen. That's going to be...
I just did it 4 seconds ago and didn't know if it would work. So
it worked. Now we know. Now we can do it a lot more. Okay. So I got a few thoughts on this. For anybody that's listening that doesn't know what multi-chain is, they used to be called AnySwap, which was a swap aggregator. I think now they've built a lot more functionality. I'm not super familiar with them, but they had billions locked in their cross-chain smart contracts. More than $1 billion. I'm not sure exactly how much, but enough that it's like a sizable amount of money. So my first thought on this is, what? Like how?
Yeah.
That was my first thought. Is like, What?
Sorry, for context, how big are they as a company? Do you know?
I'm not sure how big they are as a company. They've been around for a minute, so I would assume they've got tens of employees, like, probably multiple tens of employees.
Looking it up.
I'm
They
not
are
sure.
reported on LinkedIn to still only have under 50 employees.
Yeah, that's for sure. I would believe they're under 50. Nonetheless, OPSEC, operational security, is a pretty big deal, and that encompasses a lot of things. But that also encompasses not having a single point of failure anywhere, anytime for a business especially a business that deals with money. So not to kick a guy that's down or a gal that's down, but this should never happen, in my opinion. And this is
brutal.
This is one of those. This is another glaring example of where, if left to our own devices, the really important shit gets skipped, because it's way easier to have a single point of failure because that one person doesn't need to trust anybody else. Problem is, everybody has to trust that one person. Anyways, this to me is like pretty alarming.
We also love to talk about power and control. And so, although it could have been the staff being like, no, you take care of that, Mr. CEO, there could also be the opportunity that the CEO has power and control because it's his baby and they just didn't have the contingency for it, right? Because why would he not show up?
Yeah. So the working theory is that he may have been arrested in China. So worth noting, it's a Chinese founder, lived in China, as far as I understand. And they're thinking that potentially up to 1.5 billion that was locked in their smart contracts has been confiscated by the Chinese government. Now, I don't want to send out FUD that's unnecessary. That's just what's being reported. Cointelegraph reported that. So,
Well, they also had some sort of seizure of assets from Chinese government, didn't they?
That's what I'm talking about. 1.5.
Yeah, but I mean, like that was reported, but I didn't see anything actually reported that he was arrested.
Well, they don't know if he was arrested.
Okay.
That's the thing. That's the speculation, is that he may have been arrested. And so that's why this is like a big conspiracy theory, because the media plays up how crazy China is to all of us that live in the West. Yes. And if you talk to anybody that lives in China, they say it's not like that at all. But there have been a few cases where prominent CEOs or prominent business owners that don't do exactly what the CCP wants, Chinese Communist Party, they've been known to kind of disappear for a minute and, get shaken down a little bit and then eventually just reappear and never want to talk about it, which is kind of interesting. And so, I mean, this is crazy. Again, this just goes to show the minimum acceptable standard for teams that are building in the space, in my opinion, is far too low at the moment. Like, I think there should be an obligation. Like, this to me is negligence. It's negligence that you have $1.5 billion in assets locked up that can be confiscated, and one person has the means to manage all of that. Like, that's.
So I thought this was interesting because when I first started in crypto, I read every book I could find that was about crypto startups and their success and their failures and all that kind of stuff, docu-stories, all that kind of thing. And Coinbase also had issues like this. Obviously, they weren't operating in China and they didn't just have their CEO disappear, but their heads were so focused on the company and so much in power and control of the company that they would sleep in the office. Obviously, so they started at a San Francisco apartment and, the devs were all living together and that kind of thing. But once they actually moved into that office kind of dynamic, it was difficult for them to move away from those norms. And so they did end up with only a couple of people having access and final say and a lack of contingency because they struggled to trust others. Right. Yeah. And I think that would be really, we don't see that as much in the States now, at least not when a company starts to grow. If anything, our company is, self-organized. So I think we have access to more stuff than we probably should. But this isn't JD. It's just me defaking JD's face as one example of having too much. Anyway, but if you're in China, you probably also don't want other people to be able to take the fall if you are worried about things like the CCP, right?
It is a delicate balance. And I appreciate that you're backing, or you're at least playing devil's advocate and making the counter argument. It's a delicate balance, right? Because if you have too many people that have access, that in and of itself is a risk. It's a risk vector. I mean, there's quite a few ways now with multi-sigs and fragmented keys and password managers and all of this stuff, where often you don't have to give unfettered control to people, but there's still oversight and governance. Governance, not necessarily meaning DAO governance, but governance of how the entity is run and what happens in these contingents in these situations. I just think it's got to be balanced better. Like there should never be, especially when you're dealing with other people's money. Yes, trust is hard. 1.5 billion, that's a lot of money. I mean, even the most pure of people can be corrupted when there's enough money involved. And so, yes, you have to be careful, but you can't keep it all under the control of one person. There's a few other examples of this. Quadriga, which was a centralized exchange in Canada, 250 million just disappeared with the founder. He apparently died. I think we talked about this one other day. There's a documentary on it. There's a lot of people that lost money. I know a few personally. But anyways, like that's another example of a company that had 250 million in deposits and only one person had the keys. Like that to me is absurd. And so hopefully we get past this. Like we've had a few of these episodes now where things have happened and there's been very little oversight and almost unilateral control. FTX is another example. At least that's what they're claiming. Everybody, started to rat and point fingers at SBF. Not that I'm trying to let SBF off the hook, but anyways, something to think about. If you're launching
no resolution. For a lot of what we talk about, there's no resolution. Like we get the beginning of the news story and then like it just kind of continues endlessly.
Yeah, either that or it's just they don't really have any answers, so they just drop it.
I guess so.
Speaking
of not having any answers, Winklevoss, they're having a time today. Yeah, the double is Winklevi, right? Like Mies.
Yeah.
I think so. Yeah. I don't think it's news that they're under scrutiny from the SEC. I think that we talked about that some time ago, and that had to do with their lending program, which I think is called Gemini Earn. But that seems to be coming to fruition more because they have actually cut ties with their banking partner. The deal here is that this is kind of like your dirty swan theory, JD, is they don't want to muddy anybody up while they are under scrutiny. So they're cutting pretty well all their partnerships and ties. The biggest news on that, of course, is that they have stopped working with their bank, which is a big deal because that might make fiat, et cetera, a little bit more difficult. Kind of interesting. What do you think of this?
Yeah, part of me wants to support the Winklevi, mainly because they've really been pioneering the space since 2013, I think, 2012, like really, really early with Bitcoin. And there's a book written about them, Bitcoin Billionaires, I think it's called. Really cool book, actually, very well written, good plot, good storyline, kind of explains their history. Now, the flip side of that is they always kind of seem to be a step too late. Yeah. Or a step outside of like with their whole thing with Facebook. Obviously, they claim that it was their algorithm that Zuckerberg stole, yada, yada. There's a big lawsuit. They got paid some money, I think, in the end. But anyways, we'll have to see. Unfortunately, Gemini has just kind of slowly faded into the background. They were really, really, really focused on a Bitcoin ETF for quite some time and kept getting declined, which was, we thought, a little strange. But yeah, I mean, this is kind of just continuation of the typical SEC crap that we've been talking about where, okay, there's no clear guidelines yet. They're still trying to punish people for not following the guidelines.
So where I do think this gets interesting is that they're opening a variety of other headquarters. So a new headquarters in the UK, Gemini is looking at opening an engineering hub in India, and then derivatives exchanges outside the US, essentially anywhere but America, which brings us to our next discussion, which is that Gemini got a UAE license.
Yeah. This, again, is indicative of what's happening in the US, right? And this is a good example. I mean, Coinbase is now looking for licenses in other places.
That's the next one.
No,
Crypto.com is the next one, actually.
Yeah, Coinbase, Crypto.com, Gemini, like these are all big, used to be US-focused institutions that are now saying, we've tried. Like we talked yesterday about, who was it? Bybit leaving
Canada, but then expanding into Japan.
Yeah. And so like, I think we're just going to see more and more of that. And the problem is the longer that it goes on, like if the US gets their shit together and figures this out relatively soon, the collateral damage might not be as big because people won't have like completely moved themselves out. But I mean, if people start building their protocols around other jurisdictions, then coming back into the US will be not that big of a deal. And who's the net loser there? The US public is the net loser because everybody's just going to block US people from their application.
Yeah. Well, on that expansion, crypto.com is moving into Singapore.
Yeah, and this is like kind of to be expected. I think crypto.com, has not had its shortage of regulatory hurdles. Singapore obviously is really trying to push crypto adoption. I wouldn't be surprised if crypto.com didn't try for a Hong Kong license too. They do have a fairly solid Asian contingent.
We haven't gotten a lot of news about people applying for the Nigerian license. Remember we talked about that like a couple months ago?
Yeah, that's kind of in line with what I said the other day, though. Like all of these small jurisdictions aren't that important yet.
I think that move into Africa is going to be a big deal, and if you can get in with with a leading country, right?
I think the move into Africa is going to be important. I just think it's not number one on most platforms' priority list. I can only speak from my position. Like, would I love to have a really strong stance in Africa? Hell yeah. Is the market big enough, and is there enough users in any one jurisdiction, including Nigeria, to substantiate whatever work and compliance it might take? And if we have to adapt the protocol in any way, if it's beyond just licensing, it's hard to make the business case for that currently. Now, if there was like a unified, the United African Nations, UAF or whatever it is, if there's a unified set of regulation, totally different story, which is where MICA, I think, is pretty interesting. Hong Kong kind of being quasi arm's length from China, I think that's a really interesting jurisdiction for that reason. And there's a lot of capital in China that would flow through Hong Kong into crypto. So anyways, I don't completely disagree with you. I just think that some of these smaller jurisdictions, the Philippines, Malaysia, Japan,
and I mean, I guess that first mover advantage could hurt you, right? If you end up having to pivot in terms of regulation a few times, if like Canada, you have to have a chief compliance officer or something, and you can't afford to do that. Like there are a few ways that it could bite you to be those first movers, or it could be really successful. So I don't know. I'm surprised to not see crypto people who like risk taking those small risks.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's a bit of a double-edged sword. You're right. Being a first mover, like there's actually an entire theory written on the second mover advantage, because you can learn from all the nonsense and you can walk through the trampled path that the first mover left. If you look at like MySpace versus Facebook, or a lot of Microsoft versus Apple, or et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of these like first movers ended up with an advantage short term, and then it got quashed by somebody else coming in and just doing it better. And exactly. I mean, another example of that is some of the other L1s relative to ETH. I mean, ETH, and don't get me wrong, I love ETH. I'm grateful for ETH. But it's kind of crazy to me that ETH, with all the recent upgrades, is still inferior to almost every other L1. And even with all the L2s and all the value that's trying to be captured there, it seems strange to me. It's very Frankenstein that you have to bolt all this other shit on to make your chain work. So anyways, all of this to say, I think it'll be interesting to see what happens. I mean, we keep saying this, but I think, we need to get our shit together as an industry.
A polite way to put it.
Well, no, it's direct, because that's what needs to happen. Like, I mean, we're going to push people offshore. One of the other problems is if you're regulated somewhere, then you're going to have to abide by KYC, AML. The other risk is that as a first mover there, you're probably disadvantaged in the short term until more platforms have to do that. Because if two platforms are, all things being equal, but one I have to KYC and one I don't, if I know both teams are public and experienced and whatever, I'm going to use the one I don't have to KYC, because I just don't want KYC vectors. Although I don't really care. I fully expect that we're going to have to KYC everywhere. But anyway.
AML is actually our next topic, because we've been seeing lots going on with the FATF. We've been seeing anti-money laundering happening in everywhere. Japan, Canada, basically everywhere. And then with that new travel rule where you can't move more than 3,000 USD worth of crypto around, that was part of the FATF as well. And so people are really trying to adhere to this so that they can, continue to operate with crypto essentially. And so the UAE, while they are getting a lot of influx in terms of business and interest, they also are now starting to do anti-money laundering. And of course, the theory here is that will that prevent new business, or will that prevent new entrants of the Middle East from participating in crypto?
Yeah, it's a bit of a chicken and an egg, right? Kind of like what I just said.
Yeah,
maybe
exactly.
I should have saved that comment for after.
No, that's why we're moving into this, is because here you go.
But yeah, it's kind of an interesting one because, again, I mean, it makes sense logically that KYC AML is going to be non-negotiable in pretty much every jurisdiction globally. It's just how we transition there and who goes first that's important. So if we saw some industry Goliaths like BNB Chain, who is headquartered in Dubai, KYC everybody on the network, which they never will, but let's assume they did. Yep. Okay, now all of a sudden that's a big enough chunk of the ecosystem. Or if we saw Uniswap all of a sudden transition to KYC everybody, or something like that, then everybody would be able to comfortably follow in. But the problem is that we're seeing a lot of small protocols maybe looking at doing this. The big guys are saying, let's wait for US regulations so that we only have to adjust once. Anecdotal. That's not what they're saying publicly, but anyways, so yeah, I mean, I think we all just need to embrace the KYC AML thing because there's just no path that it isn't a requirement everywhere, in my opinion. And so
I do have one conspiracy with KYC, if you'll just bear with me here for a second. So, you have your passport or your driver's license or something, and you take a picture of it with your face. How do you know, how do you know that you're not getting rugged, you're not getting your identity stolen, etc.?
Well, you don't. And so that's where I think there's going to need to be an aggregation of KYC providers. So my preference is that no platform themselves KYCs the users, but rather there's third parties that their expertise is in KYC AML, and their expertise is in understanding, the gaps and the loopholes and all of these things that people could do to spoof the system. A, and B, they understand GDPR and all the other different identity requirements and data storage and all that stuff, and have enterprise institutional grade security and OPSEC, the way that we were just talking about, so that there's no one person that can leak information. I mean,
data leaks, like a strong zero knowledge proof leader.
Yeah, there's a lot of yes. That's a yes. ZK is really important in my opinion for identity, and I think it'll be a really critical piece of middleware that will exist in between almost every blockchain and application, I think, very soon. There's some other ways to do it. There are some other ways to do it where if ever subpoenaed by a government or a regulator, you can get the third party to release said information to the government, but you as a protocol only have, yes, no, pass, fail, US, non-US, you don't know who it is. You just know that they're, and so we'll see what happens. ZK is a huge opportunity there. Not every ecosystem has ZK components, but they're becoming more and more common now. So, it probably wouldn't be that much of a lift.
Banky tuned in today, and they were the ones who really drove the point home about ZK for me. I didn't think it was that important until I met the Banky team, who are incredible on both their security, including their personal security. And I think they touted the benefits of zero knowledge the whole time I was in the room with them. So thanks to that team for that.
At Medici, this last Medici, ZK was a pretty big topic of conversation. Space and Time is doing some really interesting tooling for zero knowledge data and how you share that data and how multiple companies don't have to create multiple versions of the same underlying data. So that will be very interesting. Generally in TradFi, as an example, if you're part of an SRO and one of the other SRO members, self-regulatory organization members, has KYC'd, then you can trust that as a legitimate KYC. And that creates a lot of consistency, and people aren't having to constantly KYC 400 times at 400 different locations with all these providers. ZK and something like what Space and Time is doing and different things really allows that to be possible. Polygon has moved to a ZK model, which is also interesting. Both founders of Polygon I talked to about it. It's exciting. I think you're right. I think ZK is definitely something that could help with that.
Okay, before we move too far from the topic of crypto.com, Gemini, and major exchanges moving into countries that are not America, essentially. What I think is really interesting about that is that they are fulfilling the regulations that have been laid out in all of those countries. So what you were saying before is it would be better if there's something like MiCA or what have you that has, a generalized regulatory body, so we know what we're signing up for and we can log in easily, or we can fulfill our regulation easily. But they're not doing that. They're like, we'll go to the UAE, we'll go to Singapore, we'll go to Hong Kong, we'll go wherever, because all of it is easier than just getting enforced by the SEC.
Yeah. Well, and that's always going to be the case, right? Like the American regulation is probably the most stringent globally in every sector, which arguments can be made as an advantage for us as a country. The counter argument is it stifles a lot of innovation. And so that's probably always going to be the case. But I do think with the US in particular, but I think if groups like MiCA or, BRICS or different ones come up with some sort of unified regulatory structure, it'll be a lot better. But yeah, water is going to flow the path of least resistance, right?
Well, so the other thing that's interesting is like, yes, water will flow the path of least resistance, but okay, so they don't want to be in Canada because we have regulation. But then you also have to think that they are basically doing a risk versus how much money they're going to make, right?
Yeah.
So even though Canada has a fairly substantial population, like, we're not huge or anything, even though we have a fairly substantial population and the regulatory compliance isn't that hard, they can tell from their current products that they're just not going to make as much money as fulfilling regulation in Singapore, where there is a higher population density and where people already primarily use a digital currency, or in the UAE, which is it's the Emirates. That's where money is. So it's kind of interesting to think about that golden ratio, right?
Well, I think if you're looking at one small jurisdiction versus another small jurisdiction, then you make that cost benefit kind of comparison and figure it out. Again, I'm probably biased to the US because I live here. But for most of not human history, but modern history, the last couple 100 years, the US has been an economic leader, especially in the last 100 years. And it's unavoidable that whatever happens in the US, many companies will try to abide by to remain competitive. But having said that, if I was looking at Canada versus Singapore, your assessment is 100% correct. Canada cost is higher. It's a bit of a pain in the ass. The other problem that I think some of these jurisdictions, by being a first mover, are having, and we can maybe end on this point. I know we've got some other stuff, but
no, this is good.
We're bumping up on time. But one of the other, I think, concerns, generally speaking, is if you accept that something is a security in one jurisdiction, it's more or less admitting that you have reason to believe that it's probably a security in other jurisdictions, based on similar assessment structures. Anyways, and so I think that's probably factoring in. So we're seeing a lot of the multinational brands, Binance, Coinbase is actually still available as far as I know in Canada, but Binance, Bybit, KuCoin, Huobi, Gate, like all of them are just saying, we can't accept that because, so they just leave in those countries. And some of them have made fairly successful businesses, avoiding the US entirely. But it's hard to argue with the size and scale and volumes of Coinbase.
Absolutely.
Which is the case study in US versus the world, in my opinion. But anyways.
Well, okay. So if you tuned in at the end, because we have a few people on Twitter Spaces, the space is recorded and you can learn all about regulatory compliance of Gemini and other large organizations and what we think about it and how it's not nearly as funny as the headlines make it sound. But make sure that you bookmark it. Make sure that you follow us, subscribe, do all the stuff. JD.
Monday to Friday, 12:30 Eastern.
Go fud yourself, JD.
Go fud yourself, Kara. Have a good one.